The elevator doors opened onto the 52nd floor at exactly 9:47 p.m., and Eleanor Whitfield stepped out the way she did every single night, quiet, unnoticed, pushing a cleaning cart that squeaked slightly on the polished marble floor. She wore the same gray uniform she'd worn for the past 3 years, her graying hair tied back in a simple bun, comfortable shoes worn soft from thousands of hours on her feet. Nobody on this floor knew her name. To the executives working late at Callaway Dynamics, she was simply the cleaning lady. A presence so routine, so expected, that most of them had stopped seeing her entirely. She moved through the glass-walled offices like a ghost, emptying trash bins, wiping down conference tables, vacuuming carpets that cost more per square foot than most people's monthly rent. Eleanor didn't mind the invisibility. In many ways, she preferred it. Tonight, like most nights, the corner office was still occupied. Marcus Callaway, CEO, 38 years old, heir to a private equity fortune he'd tripled through aggressive acquisitions, was still at his desk, phone pressed to his ear, arguing with someone about a merger that was apparently falling apart. Eleanor had learned, over the years, to move quietly around executives like Marcus. Not out of fear exactly, but out of practicality. Men like him didn't like being interrupted, and interruptions had consequences she'd rather avoid. She began wiping down the glass partition outside his office, careful not to make noise. That's when things went wrong. Marcus slammed his phone down onto the desk, the sound sharp enough to make Eleanor flinch. He stormed out of his office, face red, tie loosened, radiating the kind of fury that came from losing money he considered rightfully his. "You," he snapped, pointing directly at her. "Did you move anything on my desk?" Eleanor straightened, keeping her voice calm.
"No, sir.
I only wiped the outer surfaces. I never touch papers or—" There was a signed contract sitting right there. He cut her off, voice rising loud enough that two junior analysts working late glanced up from their cubicles. "Right there, on the left side. Now it's gone. Do you understand what that document is worth? Do you have any idea?" "I didn't move any documents, Mr. Callaway. I can assure you." "I don't want assurances," he snapped, stepping closer, close enough that Eleanor could smell the whiskey on his breath from whatever afternoon meeting had gone sideways. "I want you to understand something. People like you exist in this building because people like me allow it. One phone call, and you're replaced by tomorrow morning. Nobody would even notice. Do you understand that?" The analysts had gone completely silent now, eyes fixed on their screens, pretending not to hear, the way people always did when they didn't want to become part of someone else's humiliation. Eleanor didn't argue. She didn't raise her voice. She simply nodded, the way she always did, years of practiced composure keeping her expression unreadable. "I understand," she said quietly. "Good." Marcus straightened his jacket, some of the color draining from his face now that the outburst had run its course, though no apology followed. Men like him rarely offered one. "Just be more careful. This is a place of business, not a daycare." He turned and walked back into his office, slamming the door hard enough to rattle the glass. Eleanor stood there for a moment, cart handle gripped tightly in her hand, saying nothing. One of the analysts, a young woman named Priya, finally looked up, an apologetic expression crossing her face. "I'm sorry," Priya whispered once Marcus was out of earshot. "He's been like that all week. The Meridian deal is falling apart, and he's taking it out on everyone." "It's all right," Eleanor said softly, resuming her work as if nothing had happened at all. But something in her expression, something Priya couldn't quite place, suggested it wasn't all right at all. Not because of hurt feelings. Something else entirely. Eleanor finished her rounds an hour later, same as always, riding the freight elevator down to the lobby where her modest sedan waited in the employee parking area. But as she crossed the marble lobby, a man in an expensive charcoal suit stepped directly into her path, someone she recognized immediately, though he clearly worked hard not to be recognized himself. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure no one else was in earshot. "I apologize for the timing. Do you have a moment?" Eleanor's expression shifted instantly. Not surprise exactly, but recognition. The look of someone being pulled back into a world she deliberately stepped away from.
"Richard," she said.
"You know you're not supposed to approach me here." "I know," the lawyer said, lowering his voice further. "But the Callaway Dynamics lease renewal is due for review next week, and given tonight's incident report that just came across my desk..." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I think it's time you handled this one personally." Eleanor glanced back toward the elevator banks, toward the 52nd floor where Marcus Calloway was still fuming behind his glass office door, completely unaware that the woman he'd just humiliated in front of his own employees wasn't simply the cleaning lady assigned to his floor. She was the sole owner of the entire building beneath his feet. "Set up the meeting," Eleanor said quietly, straightening her uniform collar one final time before walking out into the New York night. It's time Mr. Calloway learned exactly who he's been talking to. Richard Ashford had been Eleanor Whitfield's personal attorney for nearly 15 years, and in that time, he'd learned never to question her decisions, even when they seemed, on the surface, deeply unconventional. Tonight was no exception. He sat across from her in the quiet study of her modest brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, a home that gave no indication whatsoever that its owner controlled a real estate portfolio worth over $4 billion. "Walk me through the lease again," Eleanor said, sipping tea from a chipped mug she'd owned longer than most of her employees had been alive. Richard opened his leather folder, adjusting his glasses. Calloway Dynamics signed a 12-year commercial lease for the top 6 floors back when Marcus's father still ran the company. Favorable terms, locked-in rate well below current market value. The lease is up for renewal in 8 days. Given current market conditions, you could easily double the rate, or decline renewal altogether and lease to any of the 3 firms currently on the waiting list. Eleanor nodded slowly, though her mind was somewhere else entirely, back nearly 40 years, to when she and her late husband, Harold, had purchased that very building with almost nothing but a loan, ambition, and a shared belief that real estate built on integrity would always outlast real estate built on ego. They'd started with 1 building. By the time Harold passed away 11 years ago, they controlled 14 properties across 3 states. After his death, Eleanor had made a decision most people in her position never would. She stepped back from the public-facing side of the business entirely, placed trusted executives in visible leadership roles, and began working, quietly and anonymously, in the buildings she owned, first as an occasional visitor, then, eventually, as actual staff. It started as grief, a way of staying close to the physical spaces she and Harold had built together, back when hard work still meant something tangible. But it became something else over time. A test. An education. Working as a janitor taught Eleanor things that no boardroom ever could. She learned which executives said thank you to the people who cleaned up after them, and which ones didn't say a word for months at a time. She learned which companies treated their support staff fairly, and which ones nickel-and-dimed maintenance workers while their CEOs took private jets to Aspen. She'd seen kindness in unexpected places, junior employees leaving thank you notes, security guards sharing coffee during slow shifts, and cruelty in expected ones. Marcus Calloway had never once, in 3 years, learned her name. "He's not a bad businessman," Richard said carefully, sensing the direction of her thoughts. "Meridian deal aside, Calloway Dynamics has been profitable." Marcus expanded his father's company significantly. "I'm not questioning his business acumen," Eleanor said quietly. "I'm questioning his character. There's a difference, Richard, and it's one I've spent my entire career trying to teach the people who work for me." She stood, walking toward the window overlooking the quiet Brooklyn street below. "Harold used to say a building's value isn't just in its address or its square footage," she continued. "It's in how the people inside it are treated, from the top floor to the loading dock. We built this company on that principle. I won't let it rot just because I've been quiet for a few years." Richard nodded, making a note. "So, non-renewal then? Or would you prefer to restructure the terms significantly upward?" Eleanor considered this for a long moment, a small, humorless smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. "Draft the paperwork for both options," she said finally. "I want to see his face first. Then I'll decide which lesson he needs more." Meanwhile, 3 floors above ground level in a very different part of the city, Marcus Calloway had no idea his entire empire was about to be tested. The next morning, he arrived at the office in a noticeably better mood, the Meridian deal partially salvaged through an overnight round of aggressive renegotiation. He passed through the lobby without acknowledging the morning security staff, barely glancing at the new receptionist struggling to remember his coffee order, and stepped into the elevator already scrolling through emails. At a team meeting later that morning, one of his junior analysts, the same young woman, Priya, who had apologized to Eleanor the night before, mentioned, cautiously, that maintenance staff deserved more recognition for after-hours work. Marcus barely looked up from his laptop. "They're contractors, Priya, not family. Let's stay focused on quarterly targets, not company culture seminars." The comment drew a few uncomfortable laughs from junior staff eager to stay in his good graces, though Priya said nothing further, simply returning her attention to her notes. jaw tight. By early afternoon, an email arrived in Marcus's inbox from the building's management office, a formal notice requesting his presence at a mandatory lease review meeting the following week, per updated ownership protocol. Marcus barely registered it, assuming it was a routine formality handled by some anonymous property management company he'd never had reason to think twice about. He forwarded it to his assistant with a brief note. "Handle this, I don't have time for landlord bureaucracy this week." He had no idea that ownership wasn't handling contract renewals through a distant corporate office this time. For the first time in company history, the actual owner had decided to attend personally. The conference room on the 40th floor had been reserved for exactly 1 hour, though Marcus Calloway hadn't bothered reading past the subject line of the meeting invite. Lease renewals were, in his experience, tedious formalities handled by junior associates and property management drones, the kind of meeting he typically sent his COO to attend in his place. But this one, his assistant had informed him with unusual insistence, required his personal attendance. Something about updated ownership protocol requiring direct executive sign-off. Marcus walked in 7 minutes late, phone still in hand, barely glancing up as he took a seat at the head of the polished conference table. Richard Ashford sat across from him, along with 2 other attorneys Marcus didn't recognize, folders neatly stacked in front of them. "All right," Marcus said, setting his phone down with visible impatience. "Let's make this quick. I've got a call with investors in 40 minutes. "Of course, Mr. Calloway," Richard said evenly. "We're just waiting on one more attendee." The door opened. Eleanor Whitfield walked in, dressed differently than Marcus had ever seen her. A tailored charcoal blazer, silver hair styled rather than tied back, reading glasses resting on a simple gold chain around her neck. But the face was unmistakably the same one he'd screamed at 3 nights earlier in front of his entire team. Marcus blinked, confusion registering before recognition fully landed. "I'm sorry, do you work for the building management company?" "I own the building, Mr. Calloway," Eleanor said, taking her seat calmly at the opposite end of the table. "I have for the past 38 years. The room went completely silent. Marcus's expression shifted through several stages in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, and finally, as the memory of that night fully surfaced, something close to horror. He started, then stopped, glancing at Richard as if hoping someone would tell him this was some elaborate mistake. "You're the cleaning." "I clean the 52nd floor most weeknights, yes," Eleanor said, folding her hands calmly on the table. "Among other floors. It's been a personal habit of mine for several years now, Mr. Calloway. One I found rather informative." Marcus's face had gone pale. "I had no idea. If I'd known." "That's precisely the point," Eleanor said, her voice calm, measured, without a trace of anger. "You didn't know. And more importantly, it didn't matter to you either way. You didn't speak to me the way you did because you thought I was beneath your notice as the janitor. You spoke to me that way because, in your mind, some people simply exist to be spoken to like that, regardless of who they turn out to be." Marcus opened his mouth to respond, but no defense came. The junior analysts' faces from that night flashed behind his eyes, the way they'd gone silent, the way Priya had looked at him afterward with quiet disappointment he dismissed at the time as oversensitivity. "Mrs. Whitfield, Eleanor is fine," she said, sliding a folder across the table toward him. "Given the circumstances, formalities feel somewhat unnecessary now." Richard opened his own folder, addressing the room in a measured, professional tone. "Calloway Dynamics leases up for renewal in 6 days. Given current market rates, Ms. Whitfield's legal team has prepared 2 possible paths forward." Marcus stared at the folder in front of him without opening it, his usual confidence entirely absent. "And which path would you prefer, Eleanor?" "That depends," Eleanor said, "on whether the man sitting across from me right now is capable of becoming someone different than the one who screamed at an employee in front of his own staff 3 nights ago." The words landed harder than any shout could have. Marcus, for the first time in longer than he could remember, had nothing prepared to say. Word of the meeting didn't stay contained to that conference room for long. By the following afternoon, a junior associate present for logistics had mentioned it to someone at another firm in the building, who mentioned it to someone else, and within 48 hours, a business journalist covering New York commercial real estate had the story confirmed through public property records. The reclusive billionaire owner of one of Manhattan's most valuable commercial towers had spent years working anonymously as janitorial staff inside her own buildings. The story spread quickly, not because of the wealth involved, though the number certainly caught attention, but because of the specific, undeniable irony at its core. A CEO known for his aggressive, often callous treatment of support staff had unknowingly humiliated the very woman who held his company's entire future in her hands. Marcus Calloway's name trended locally within a day, though not for the reasons he'd ever wanted. And back in her quiet Brooklyn brownstone that evening, Eleanor Whitfield sat with Richard's finalized paperwork in front of her, both options still on the table, waiting for one final decision only she could make. By the time the story broke publicly, Marcus Calloway's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Board members demanded explanations. Investors asked pointed questions about company culture and leadership judgment. A few reporters camped outside Callaway Dynamics' lobby, hoping for a statement. For the first time in his career, Marcus understood what it felt like to be watched by people who had already decided what kind of man he was, the exact feeling, though he didn't realize it, that Eleanor had quietly observed in others for years. He requested a second meeting. Eleanor granted it. This time, Marcus arrived early, alone, without his usual entourage of assistants and attorneys. He sat across from Eleanor in the same conference room, though the confidence that once radiated off him was entirely gone, replaced by something closer to humility, or at least, the beginning of it. "I've spent the last 2 days thinking about nothing else," Marcus said quietly. "I built a reputation as someone tough, decisive, someone who didn't waste time on sentiment. I told myself that's what leadership required. But I never stopped to think about what it actually looked like from the other side of that." Eleanor listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. "I'm not asking you to renew the lease," Marcus continued. "I know I don't have the right to ask for anything right now. I just wanted to apologize directly. Not because it's good for optics, because it's true." Eleanor studied him for a long moment. "Apologies are easy to give once consequences arrive, Mr. Calloway. The question I care about is what you do when no one's watching and there's nothing to gain from being kind." "Then give me the chance to show you," he said. Eleanor considered this carefully. She hadn't built her career on cruelty or revenge, and she wasn't about to start now, however tempting the moment might have been. Instead, she slid a single sheet of paper across the table. Not the lease renewal itself, but a new set of terms altogether. "The lease will be renewed," she said, "on one condition. Callaway Dynamics will implement a company-wide policy guaranteeing fair wages, benefits, and formal respect protocols for all contracted staff, janitorial, security, maintenance, effective immediately, audited annually by an independent party of my choosing." Marcus read the document slowly, then looked up. "And if I agree? Then you'll have proven something to yourself that no lease agreement ever could," Eleanor said. "Whether or not you agree, Mr. Calloway, is entirely up to you. But know this, my decision isn't about punishing you. It's about making sure the people in this building are never invisible to the person running it. Not the way I once chose to be, and not the way you assumed I always would be." Marcus signed the document without hesitation. Months passed. The story faded from headlines, as most stories eventually do, but its effects lingered inside Callaway Dynamics far longer than the initial embarrassment. Marcus, to the quiet surprise of his own staff, began arriving early enough to greet the morning cleaning crew by name. He authorized raises for contracted maintenance workers across the building, funded a scholarship for employees' children, and, perhaps most tellingly, stopped raising his voice in front of his team altogether. Eleanor never returned to cleaning the 52nd floor herself. Her identity, once revealed, made the quiet anonymity she'd valued impossible to maintain. But she continued visiting her buildings regularly, no longer in uniform, but still choosing, deliberately, to speak with the staff others tended to overlook. The security guards working overnight shifts, the maintenance workers arriving before sunrise, the people whose names rarely appeared on any company directory. One evening, months later, a new employee, a young woman mopping the lobby floor during a quiet Tuesday shift, glanced up as Eleanor walked past on her way to a board meeting. "Ma'am," the young woman said, somewhat nervously, clearly aware of who Eleanor was. "I just wanted to say, the new wage policy, the benefits changes, it's made a real difference for me and my family. Thank you." Eleanor paused, offering the woman a small, genuine smile. "Don't thank me," she said quietly. "Just remember how it feels to be seen. And when you're the one with power someday, make sure you extend that to someone else." She continued on toward the elevator, disappearing into the quiet hum of a building she'd built from nothing, one that, thanks to a single humiliating night nobody involved would ever forget, had finally become the kind of place her late husband had always believed it could be. The end.